Participating in our conversation is Father Peter Fink, who is on staff at Ignatius House, and Marian Monahan, a spiritual director and volunteer with the Ignatian Spirituality Project. Our topic this evening is finding joy in the midst of addiction recovery. We know that this time of social isolation can especially be a challenge for those in recovery or for those who have a loved one in recovery. Peter's going to take the lead with some opening remarks, but I've asked Marian to open us first with a prayer.
God of compassion, we have in mind all the people right now who are grieving, those in the hospital, frontline workers, families who are trying to manage work, school, but especially, yes, families that can't get to their meetings, those that are suffering with addictions, those that love people who are suffering with addictions. And in your love and compassion, you see us all, love us as we are, and accept us always as we are. So for that, we thank you. And amen.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our sessions on Easter Joy. And tonight, we're going to speak about the joy of recovery. My name is Father Peter Fink. I am on the staff of Ignatius House Retreat Center, and myself almost 10 years in recovery. And we know that the path to recovery covers many addictions, and there are many paths to recovery. My own path is sobriety from alcohol, and my path makes me a friend of Bill. I can only talk of my own experience in the hope that it might be of value to others on their road to recovery from alcohol or from any other addiction, and possibly even from the current virus. And those of us who are indebted to the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a great invitation to joy in the promises. A phrase, if we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. That kind of amazement is what joy is about. These promises held out to anyone who wishes to be free of addiction of any kind. None of us start the journey until we hit that amorphous thing called the bottom. But it's that moment of powerlessness, that moment of total mismanagement of our lives that makes us say, I don't want to do this anymore. And that's where the road begins. Now, the promises can seem too distant or too impossible when one takes that first chip to recovery. But when you look at the people around you and realize that those promises are already being realized. The famous saying, God is doing to us what we cannot do for ourselves. Now, I know that the God issue is of concern. Some have walked away from God. The God has been presented to them in their youth. Some simply don't believe in God. Some doubt about it. But sooner or later, everyone realizes that there's someone or something who is not me, who's there to guide and help me. So I am in recovery, but I'm also a Jesuit priest. And some of you may know that there was a Jesuit priest who met and became friends with Bill Wilson as the 12-step program was coming to be. Father Ed Dowling recognized the similarity between the journey of the 12 steps and the journey that Ignatius of Loyola put in his spiritual exercises, which are the stock and trade of the Jesuit order and Jesuit companions. So I deal with the spiritual exercises as well. Now, Bill Wilson proposed the promises as the path to sobriety. Well, in the spiritual exercises, Ignatius offers some additional guidelines towards fulfilling those promises. Ignatius names it the principle and foundation. Like the promises, It's not something that happens all at once. It's a journey that you take throughout your lifetime. But in the exercises, the principle and foundation asks things like this: who is your God? It asks, what does it mean that you're not the author of your own life? It asks you to address the choices that you make. And it makes really exactly what the Serenity Prayer is about. Some kind of assessment of the things I can't change and acceptance of it, and only changing the things that can be changed. Now, once I admit that I'm powerless, well, the principle of a foundation brings you to the one who is able to guide me forward. Christians call it God, but it's a God that each person needs to find and name. It's a reality that's in your heart, and in your heart, it yearns to be set free. Name it however you will, but let it out. Let it be free. It will save you. Well, the exercises give you a personality. There's a personality to this higher power. The 12 steps invite you to name the higher power in whatever way you want, but the exercises promises a God who is simply in love with you. Now, this is what the exercises are about. Let me just sort of mention it because it's really a piece of it. So the goal of our life, this is one translation, the goal of our life is to live with God, our higher power, forever. At its depth, this higher power loves us, gave life to us. Our own response to love allows God's love, God's life, to flow in us without limit. All things in this world, all are gifts from God, presented to us so that we can know that God is always with us and leads us to make a return to love. And so we appreciate and use these gifts insofar as they help us develop as loving persons. Now, this higher power, it's someone with whom I can be related. And the more I listen, the more I realize just how deeply he, she, it, they, however you name it, really loves us. So Ignatius goes further. If any of these gifts become the center of our lives, addiction, they displace God and so hinder our growth towards our goal. In everyday life, we must hold ourselves in balance before all these creative gifts insofar as we have a choice and are not bound by some previous obligation. Now that's freedom. In this short period of time, I can only say a few things about further things about this principle and foundation, but it really is a key to freedom. So these are just a few scattered pieces, and I'll finish that and lead us into a conversation. Just by being of the earth, each of us has a unique original purpose. The God who creates us puts into each of us a unique original purpose. Well, sobriety is to discover that purpose and to live it fully. Second, you are unique and unrepeatable. So who am I and what am I to become? That's the question. Well, to live with God is to become what God hopes for in you. God's hope depends on your realizing that. Well, finally, one last thing. God creates me out of love in particular time and place with a particular talents and temperaments, strengths, limitations. And God continues to create and reveal who God is to me and who I am before God. God invites me to partner with God, to build a more just and gentle world. And sobriety is to be who God made me to be, honor myself, and to honor the uniqueness of everyone else. So that's a start, and I hope it invites some comments or concerns or whatever in our way to recovery. And now I pass it on to my colleague here, Marian.
Thank you, Peter. It's really good to hear your comments, and I'm going to riff off of a few things that you said. I'm going to start with the word freedom because the exercises are about, St. Ignatius's hope for us and God's hope for us that we can be free. And the more we notice our attachments and can deal with them one by one, and we can call them addictions, attachments, the freer we are to love, not only to love God, love ourselves, but love the people in our lives. And to me, the 12 steps are a similar path. So one of the things you mentioned was about God or God as we choose to understand God. And that makes me so happy for the steps, because the steps don't eliminate anybody. They allow a person to come to the steps, come to a meeting, Al-Anon, AA, OA, and to be received no matter what their belief is about a higher power. So they get to name it. And that means that everybody can come in and feel welcome. And that's going to lead me to my next comments. You talked about your recovery. So my first experience with Al-Anon, I realized today as I was thinking about it, was way back in 1978, 79. A dear friend of mine, when we lived in Illinois, her husband was dealing with addictions, and she was raising 3 small children, and she befriended a woman who was very involved in Al-Anon, the 12 steps. And thereby, I got to hear and glean and have some of those conversations. At the same time, we were in the middle of dealing with some alcoholism in my husband's family of origin. I grew up with alcoholism also in my family. So that was my first taste. But my first meeting that I attended was in the 80s. And I can remember walking into that first meeting, encouraged by another friend of mine who had people in her life that were dealing with addictions, and feeling that it was the most Christian, and I'm going to use that word, most Christian group I had ever been in. Complete non-judgment, full acceptance, everybody around the room exchanging courage and hope and encouragement to one another. It was amazing to me to be in a group like that. It was really the first time that I could be in a place where we was a level playing field. We were there for one reason. Someone we loved was dealing with an addiction, and we wanted to find our way out to freedom. We wanted to find our way to cope, and not only cope, to live well. So I've been in and out of Al-Anon some of my adult life. But if it's okay, I also just want to share, when you talk about the joy of recovery, and my first real joyful experience with that was when my brother got sober. My brother passed away in 1992. My brother Richie was 13 years older than me. So growing up was like I was an only child in a sense. I have 2 brothers much older than me, and I got to know him when we were adults, when I was an adult. But the last 11 years of his life, he got into the program and got sober. He had 66 days, and about 3 years later, he went back for good. And I can remember he wrote me a note about he was in probably 9 months or so, just trying to make amends, saying that he loved me and loved my family. I can remember running to my girlfriend's house with this card in my hands, showing her what my brother had written. But when I saw him, the first time I saw him after he went into the program was when I realized fully the miracle that he had experienced, because literally his face looked different, his demeanor was different. None of the angst, the chaos was gone. He was peaceful, he was loving. And then we began a beautiful relationship of sharing my spirituality, his spirituality and the steps, my way of understanding God, his way. And he taught me so much about what it meant to be free. He taught me so much about what it was to be caught in his addiction and what it meant to come out of it. So I can still remember the joy I had and had all those years. And since then have had friends who have gone into the program And so I want to call it secondhand joy almost, but I feel so happy for them. And it's just an honor. It's an honor to hear a person's story of recovery. So now I'm going to pass it back to you, Peter.
Well, I don't know. Hey, does Andy have something to say here?
You know, the thing that came to mind was, I don't know if you could talk about the theme of grace, or even a Christian understanding of grace, when it comes to the steps, because it seems to me that that's a big theme that runs through.
Yeah, yeah. One of the issues that I have had to deal with, I was talking to Marian earlier, is the issue of anonymity, because obviously, whenever I talk, and obviously Marian also, uh, we don't talk about other people. But I had to be in a situation. I was in a church in New York where there were many people who were with either with alcohol or with drugs or with other addictions. And when I first went away to a rehab place, I made it very clear I was not going to be hidden away somewhere. And so I used to write things back to the parish, and all sorts of things. And it was important. It was important for me to realize, and when I came back, it was important for me to realize that to announce that you're an alcoholic and that you are in recovery is a great gift to the people that you serve. And in addition, because I'm a priest, I have to use wine for Mass. Well, I have permission to use a non-alcoholic wine. And I just felt it's not fair that I should choose just for myself. But I had the issue. I said I wanted to make it available to people, but I could not have somebody over here giving that chalice out. It had to stay on the altar. If anyone wanted it, they would come up and take it. That's their choice. But we did. So it was a very delicate kind of thing. But it's a very important thing that being an alcoholic, I became something that was able to help other people. And that was a very good part of my ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that even, I've encouraged people when they've shared with me struggles they're having with a family member to consider going to Al-Anon. I know any of these things are scary at first, but also what you do is you wind up, those people inspire you, and you have hope knowing your life can get better. So I agree with you. We need to know people who are in recovery, if they're willing to share it. I also want to say something about, you mentioned grace, Andy, and I absolutely, it is about grace, but I like that. I never watched the show Will and Grace, but I love these two words together, because it has to be my yes, my desire, my moving forward, and God's grace. And they work in concert. And when they work in concert, miracles happen. So, so I think it's both. It's this beautiful relationship of knowing that God is empowering me to make the changes.
I just want to share, thank you for that, the working in concert with one another, that it's a partnership. And, in Ignatian spirituality, I talk all the time about how this whole thing, the spiritual life, is a collaboration with God. I want to share a couple of comments from Facebook. Kathy says, it's interesting and compelling to hear your stories. She says there's a difference between just quitting or drinking or gambling or refraining from an attachment and the joy of the freedom Marian spoke to in her brother. And then also Sarah asks, how has your joy grown throughout your recovery, or was it most palpable at the beginning?
I would answer that very quickly and say it has certainly grown, like everything else. And it grows, the first statement is that just stopping drinking or stopping taking drugs or whatever the addiction might be, that's a first step. But it's not really sobriety. Sobriety is really what those promises are really about. I mean, there's a great section in, I can find it in my earlier text, which I probably won't be able to, but that's all right. That about the promises, when it talks about it's a joyful place. Um, well, but I mean, it talks about the freedom that you have, and the more you are within on the path of recovery, you begin not only to deal with your own addiction, but also with what 5 and 6 or 6 and 7 rather are about, all of your character defects. And character defects are things that limit you in a variety of different ways. And so if you constantly, and that's the harder journey, constantly try and move away from those character defects, you gain greater freedom, you gain greater joy, you gain greater, and actually, if you even play further into the 12-step program, the final one is to be available to help others. Because the most important thing of addiction is not just stopping yourself and not just making yourself, a nice-looking person, but being able to pass on to someone else what has been given to you. Because recovery is not something that you achieve. It's something that's been given to you. Mm-hmm. In New York, there was one of the guys who was 30 years. Whenever he announced that, he always say, "I was given 30 years." He never said, "I achieved 30 years." I was given. And that's the grace. So, yeah, I would say that the longer you stay in the program, the more joyful it is. It's also more difficult. It is not easy when you stay in the program. You get tired of it. You get tired of going to meetings. You get tired of a lot of things. But you know that lots of miracles are happening in the people around you. You can share some of it. You can receive some of it. It's a great thing.
Yeah, so it's an ongoing journey, just like the spiritual life is always a growing, moving journey. And so the steps really provide this beautiful way to do that personal inventory. In mindfulness, we call it being the outside observer of myself, noticing what I'm doing, what I'm trying to control, when I'm being dysfunctional, while I'm not setting good boundaries, whatever it is, when I'm not being loving, whatever language you want to use. So the looking inward helps then me to become, I hope, a more loving, compassionate human being in the world. So it's always a process. I want to say too, what Peter just said about the growing joy, but it's also hard, or the joy keeps growing. When my brother died, we were at his funeral. When he was 54 when he died. When he was 50, he got a big Harley and he got a big tattoo, and he rode around with his AA buddies. And anyway, so that was his personality. But when he died and at his funeral and at the wake, his friends told us what he had done for them, how much he had helped them in their own recovery. Something he never talked about was what he was doing for others. His whole life changed. But that was so beautiful because it was like the fullness of the steps. It's admitting my powerlessness, looking at myself, asking God to change, and then continuing, and then helping other people. So yeah, it was lovely. And I think for him, it probably continued to grow. He had a lot of amends to make up for, and I think he tried for his whole life.
There's Jean on Facebook commented, can't force solutions. We're given free will. And she talks about how God never forces, right? I always say God never dictates, God invites. Was there ever a point in recovery where, or I guess what was that point where you realized that you can't force the grace? God had to take over.
Well, I would say that you can always spot, I call the bottom, you can always spot a moment. And you should never, ever forget what that bottom is, however you do it. But it's never really just the bottom. And if you're dealing with that phrase that God is doing for us that we could not do ourselves, I would say that long before I got into the program, God was already guiding me. And so I didn't think it was some radically new thing. After all, I'm a theologian. I know all sorts of things. I always say, a lot of people don't understand God. I had too much God, but the one thing for me, there was a single moment, and I can think it was a single sentence that was a critical sentence when somebody asked me, "What was it like when you stopped drinking?" And I couldn't answer the question. And that was the issue. Just that simple statement. What is it like when you stop drinking? And I had no idea. And then I had to make a choice. That really hit me. And sometimes it could have hit me before it would have been passed by, but that's the one that hit me. And then the choice was, do I keep drinking or do I throw it all away? I threw it all away. But that was so. But but even there, I could look back and say that was God doing something for me. This wasn't me.
And from an Al-Anon point of view, there's a saying, don't create a crisis, but don't prevent a crisis. So don't create one and you can't prevent one. And so from that point of view, you can't force another person to do even what is in their best interest. And so you have to let go. And a lot of the process and the steps then for a person who loves a person who's dealing with an addiction is to lovingly hold them and let them go, because you can't control their behavior. It's really hard when it's someone you're close to and someone you love and someone you know can literally hurt themselves. But you can't force it for them. It has to be them that comes to that decision.
Sarah says, Peter mentioned being amazed and how that's connected to joy. How are you both amazed today regarding your journey?
That's a good question. Amazed. I'm amazed when I'm sitting at a meeting and somebody comes in and they're in for the first time and they have not had it. They're doing what I said, that first, what they call that white chip, the first chip. It's amazing to see people continually seeking recovery. I mean, one of the interesting things about the program is that it says you only come into the program when you want to stop drinking. It comes out of you, drinking or whatever, but I'm just going to stay with the drinking. When you want to stop drinking, you come into the program. I had a situation in New York when somebody came in and they wanted me to talk to somebody else. Somebody else came in. And the guy sat there and told me 5 different reasons he wanted to keep drinking. So we said, what should I do? And I said, keep drinking. And I said, if you finally come to a point where you don't want to drink, come on back. Because I think, so part of the amazement is just seeing, we use that phrase, the miracles, to see the miracles that happen, whether it be someone just coming into the program, someone who says, I've been 42 years sober. That's an enormous, so there's a lot of amazement when you see what happens in that sense of the joy that comes from being sober. Yeah, that's what I meant by it anyway. Marian, what do you think?
Yeah, I love the word amazement too, because just in the last 48 hours, I had 2 amazing conversations. One was via text and one was over the phone with people who are in recovery. A dear friend of mine who's now probably got 10 years recovery, and how much it has meant in her life. It's still amazing. She just recently lost a parent. She had to hold up her whole family with all the things going on. She got through it beautifully. She was a pillar of strength as she was grieving, and it's amazing and beautiful to observe, to be a part of her life. And then another person I talked to a couple of days ago who's had a couple of stories of the journey that they're on and moving towards what you described, Peter, this continuum, but in recovery making progress, and it's so beautifully amazing. So for me, it's observing that, and it never gets old. It's always beautiful, and I do use the word miraculous. I don't know what else to call it.
That phrase of people going through really difficult things. When somebody just shares that, they say, somebody died, somebody got sick. This is all going on, and I didn't have a drink.
Yep, amen. That's exactly right.
That's the joy. That's the joy I'm talking about. Sort of like I went through it all, and I didn't have a drink.
I want to offer an opportunity to offer some final thoughts, but I want to acknowledge that there could be someone listening who recognizes that they have an addiction issue, but they're just quite not yet at the place to attend a meeting. Is there any advice or encouragement that you would give someone like that?
If they really wanted to stop, let's say again with drinking or stop whatever, but if they really wanted to stop, I would simply talk with them. I would give them some courage. I would probably speak about some of the miracles that happen. I would try and ease them into the point where they would want to say, maybe I could give it a try. Maybe I can give it a try.
Yeah, and the fact is that there's people change. People can change. Their lives can change. I just want to mention the Ignatian Spirituality Project too, that Ignatius House sponsors, and retreats for men and women in addiction recovery who are also experiencing homelessness, but many of their lives have changed because they've met a God who loves them, and they're in a program. So I would encourage anyone, wherever they were at, whether it was a family member or someone that was wondering about their own drinking, to just take somebody's hand. Someone will go with them and get to a meeting and see that they're going to be accepted and loved.
Yeah, one final thing. At Ignatius House, we do at least 2 recovery retreats each year. And this year, because of the whole closure of everything, we're going to start up at the end of June and begin going from there in a variety of different ways. But the first retreat that I will offer is a recovery retreat, and it's going to be on steps 1, 2, and 3. It's going to be on the step that's trying to find God in our midst and in our lives. Later on, we do one on that Drop the Rock, 5 or 6 and 7, and another one done on 11 and 12. So, but the one on June 26th to 28th, if it's something that you would find interesting, this 2-night retreat is maybe a good part of your own recovery. So I'd welcome you, and I would welcome you if you come.
Well, thank you both, Peter and Marian, and thank you all of us for joining us this evening for this conversation. We invite you to join us next week at the same time when Father Joe Lingen comes back to join us along with our friend Kathy Spornick as we discuss finding joy in the midst of grief. We invite you to keep connected to all of our upcoming offerings, virtual and in person, at ignatiushouse.org. You can follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Be well and have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.